Welcome to the Cycle World Podcast. I'm Mark Hoyer. I'm with Kevin Cameron, our technical editor. Today we'll be talking about Dan Gurney, specifically Dan Gurney's moment canceling twin, which we'll talk about what that is.
And where
Dan Gurney, what's that?
And where its intended use was.
Yep. Dan Gurney, American hero, won a Formula One race in a car of his own construction. Bruce McLaren's the only other fella to do that. Two pretty big names in motorsports. Dan Gurney, the champagne spray shaker guy who was the first guy who did that for that tradition that we all carry on. All-American racers, Santa Ana, California. Dan was a huge motorcycle fan. Was an importer of Montes's for a little bit, and just always loved riding, but he was also very tall. And he also, so what did he say? He said, I always felt like I was going to tip over forward when he was braking downhill on a conventional motorcycle. And he rode a chopper, and he did some other stuff, and he was a race car driver. I went to lunch with Dan Gurney many years ago, and he had a Toyota Sienna minivan, part of his GTP effort, where they made 1,100 horsepower through what do you call it, the Hummingbird sphincter, because they kept putting a bigger restrictor plate on his GTP car.
Yeah.
And he and his engineer, I'm sure Drino Miller was the principal guy responsible for that, but they were able to continue just smashing the race wins with that car, and kept doing it through a smaller and smaller restrictor. But Dan Gurney in a Sienna, I was dying because I got to ride shotgun as we went to lunch, and his seat was incredibly reclined, like it was like flat. And I was like, Dan, what is that? And he's like, oh, you just get used to it after a while, because all his Formula One cars and race cars were all like that. And that's how he drove his Sienna to that Mexican place they always went to. So that was remarkable. That was for a different story. It was Gurney's Hallway. It was adjacent to some other stuff about the Alligator. And the A1 Alligator was a proof of concept that they did way back in the day with an Honda XL350 single. And then by the time there was something for sale, it was called the A6. And it had a 708cc single-cylinder Honda engine. It was a Honda XR650L engine, but had been given the full Gurney treatment. And I have never ridden a single that runs like that. I rode an earlier version that had that, I believe, with a carburetor. The fuel was behind you, and the engine, it's recumbent, so you're sitting in between the engine, which is right in front of your face, kind of. And then you have a backrest, and there it was, and it had a shield over a trumpet intake, like an aluminum shield with a little frame, and it was just open in the air. So this thing is just megaphoning in your face. It was an intense experience, and it was one of the more prototypey ones that had tubular frame and all that. By the time we did a road test, it had twin trumpet fuel injection, and it had a airbox cover that went over it. It was still fabulously loud. It had an under seat muffler sort of under the chassis, a la Buell and many manufacturers now, with barely any muffling. And it dynoed at 65 horsepower. It 0 to 30 in 1.1 seconds because it was so long. You could just, Don Kane did the testing, 0 to 30 in 1.1, 0 to 60 in 3.1. And, Superbikes could do 0 to 60 in 3.1. But they were doing it with 150 horsepower and then struggling, like you have to be so careful to get something that tall off the line versus this thing, which it was like a dragster. Amazing impression with that single cylinder. It was about 35,500 for the ones he was making at that time. But he always wanted more. He always wanted more than just...
Well, it's Southern California, isn't it?
Yeah, then a ripping 708cc big bore, high revving single beautiful broad power. No, let us note also that Chuck Palmgren, who was a national level racer, and a tuner, had worked for Dan forever, and on the motorcycle projects, Chuck was always involved.
Yep.
So tell us about Dan's desire for more, Kevin.
Well, you work on this concept. You've got this motorcycle which naturally has a longish wheelbase, and you don't want it to get so long that you can't go around a corner, you can't change direction quickly, because the front wheel allows you to move the lever, which is the wheelbase, to steer the rear wheel. The longer that lever is, the smaller the angle through which an inch of displacement at the front will steer the rear wheel. So long chassis are associated with turning that takes a long time. And for example, when Cook Nelson described his bevel drive Ducati on which he won the 1976 Daytona Superbike race, or was it 77? He said it steers like it's on rails. Locomotives are on rails and they don't steer at all. So it's hard to understand this, but that thing had a 60-inch wheelbase. So this is a problem. You need the length to have a feet first motorcycle, but you want to get rid of the length. You want to compress the length in the interest of high turning performance. Well, the single cylinder engine looked like the optimum solution because it's only one cylinder long, or one crankshaft long. So eventually he decided, okay, I'm going to put a big V-twin in this thing, and I'm going to see how that goes. So 120-inch S&S motor with either Gurney heads or reworked S&S heads, and making some good power, and with rubber mounting, and I believe billet cases, and it vibrated.
Well, let us pause for a moment to say that if there was any company that you wanted to work on the breathing of an internal combustion engine, it would be Dan Gurney's All-American Racers. Back to Westlake heads, all of that stuff, all of that attention to flow, all of Dan Gurney's inventiveness, the Gurney flap. There's a famous picture of him in the All-American Racer shop at the drill press where he's pulling down the drill press arm, and he has a bathroom scale and a spring, and they're pulling it down and measuring how many pounds per inch.
Spring rate. Yep.
Spring rate, right?
We all use the drill press that way. That's how you do it.
Well, it's funny that Justin Gurney, his son, who's, around my age, and I see him in Southern California at car and motorcycle events. We own Dan's old XR 1200X as a family, and so we talk about that and so forth. But he recently someone posted that photo of Dan at the drill press and was like, "Oh, that's dangerous. He's going to put his eye out or whatever." And Justin's response was, "Well, he raced a magnesium car surrounded by gasoline with no seatbelt at the Nürburgring.
Yep.
He's not really worried about the spring in the drill press." I was dying, and it's very true. In any case,
yes, if too much is just enough, everything is justified.
Yeah, you would if you wanted a car with efficient cylinder heads and good breathing, no matter what constraints you might have, whether it's 2-valve or it's a GTP car that's breathing through an orifice that's this big and making 1,000 horsepower. All-American Racers is where you'd want it. Like, I wish that they had done engine modifications on this XR 1200X. Like, oh, let's just kiss the heads a little bit and do a little, just to get a taste of that magic. Airflow would have been king over there.
Well, I saw that bike at the Quail motorcycle gathering one year. It was parked out front of the hotel where um, we were lodged, and Dan wasn't around. Later, I asked him about the bike. I'd seen it there with that big old V twin, and he said it vibrates. And he said, what I always have to say about vibration is that it fatigues parts until they break and fall off. So this way he was able to get around all of that talk about vibration is good for you, man up and live it up. And there are countless examples of motorcycles that vibrated and whose parts fatigued and fell off. In 1953, NSU decided to rejoin international road racing with a transverse inline four. And Rotor, the designer, gave it separate cylinders and heads so that everything had these loose fitting couplings, the camshafts and so forth. And how many vibratory modes did it have with cylinders doing this and back and forth? Well, it frothed the fuel in the float bowls so that it wouldn't carburate, and parts broke off. Kawasaki, for the first 2 years of their tandem twin, which is two cylinders, one ahead of each other with counter-rotating geared together crankshafts, they decided they would have one piston up when the other one was down. It seems intuitively no worse than a parallel twin, which does the same. But a parallel twin not only vibrates, but breaks parts, engine mounts specifically. Well, on the KR, it broke the exhaust pipe. They fixed it so that sometimes when you went for the lever, if the little parts inside the check valve was vibrating in a certain direction, you pulled the lever, it just came smoothly to the bar as you whizzed past your brake marker.
We had an MV Augusta with Nissan brakes that did that.
Yeah.
Yeah, we did at, it was years and years ago, 20 years ago. I was doing it at Willow where the lever would start to come back and you'd have to pump it back up. And then we ran it on the dyno and that engine vibration caused that same, scenario.
And when Kenny Roberts' team built their 3-cylinder 500, the first version had no counterbalancing shaft. Later version, I think the second version and third, Mr. Oguma, retired from Honda, sort of came by and said, here, let me fix that for you. Because it did things like break off the rear subframe and all kinds of other stuff that just gave up under all that fatigue. So when I talked to him about that V-twin powered bike, he said, I'm going to have to fix this. And he said, can I call you up? Well, let's talk about this. So I thought, whoa, okay. Yeah, I'd love to. And of course, the kinship was that although I'm supposedly a journalist, I don't write about the excitement. I'm not excited about the excitement. I'm excited about what happened. And I think Dan had to be a pretty practical person to achieve the success that he had in racing. So anyway, at one point, I'm wandering around in this huge building where the SAE is having an annual meeting, Cobo Hall or someplace. And there's Dan Gurney. Oh, he said, just the guy I wanted to talk to. Here, let's pop into this classroom. So we go, he said, we can sit down. So we go in and sit down, and we're talking about different stuff. The door opens. Somebody looks in. Oh, I'm sorry. Closes the door, goes away. He instantly, obviously, recognized there's Dan Gurney in there. You can't go in. He's talking about stuff. And 2 or 3 more people stuck their heads in the door before we both realized they want this classroom for a scheduled meeting. And so we went to the door and said, "Well, we'll vacate now. You can move ahead with your program." But that just shows that crowd, Society of Automotive Engineers attendees, all recognized Dan by sight. Didn't need any introduction. So he was interested in this idea of the counter-rotating crankshafts. And the cool thing about it, Kawasaki corrected the original design, which Mr. Sato had drawn, thinking that this motion was no worse than a parallel twin, because parallel twins are usually 180-degree firing two strokes. And what they did was they added a counterweight to each crankshaft that was equal to all of the reciprocating weight on one assembly. Now, if you see that the two pistons are at top, they phase them to move the pistons simultaneously. With two pistons at top center, the two counterweights are at bottom center, and they're pulling down as hard as the pistons are pulling up. So that's canceled. Then at the 90-270 position, the pistons are in mid-stroke, so they're exerting hardly any force on anything, because they're neither accelerating nor decelerating. And the two counterweights are either this way or this way, and they cancel each other. So all the way through the cycle, it's self-balancing. And this shouldn't be too surprising, considering that a BMW Boxer twin basically does the same thing with the cylinder axes 90 degrees apart on a single crankshaft. So I thought this was a great idea for a big twin, because the thing that Ducati achieved in 1972 when Paul Smart won the Imola 200 was they showed that a big twin, which is normally associated with heavy vibration, parts fatigue, and pieces falling off, could be made to have zero primary shaking force. Well, there are the 4 ways to do this. There's the Dan Gurney way, which was Kawasaki's second try, and it worked. There's the Max Friese way. He designed the original Boxer twin for BMW, but he was an aircraft guy, so he couldn't design an engine that would shake its way out of a fabric-covered wooden airplane. And the 90-degree system of that Ducati adopted for the bevel twin, and Honda's system of staggered crank pins, which allows you to use cylinder angles in between those extremes. Unfortunately, well, for example, one engine that used this system was the RS750, the dirt tracker that Honda built, which succeeded in dominating AMA flat track for a period of time. And nobody expected a Japanese company to come and want that to do that and succeed in doing it. But that was the balancing system that they used, because they couldn't use a 90-degree engine because it was too long. Dirt tracker, look at the pinnacle of dirt track design, which for years and years was the KR750 Harley. And it's like you put the engine on a stand and rolled the front and rear wheels up until they almost touched the engine, and said, make a bracket that'll hold all this stuff together. As short as it could be. So this was a good solution for Dan's project, because although it would add the length of another cylinder, which would, okay, could be a problem, he also designed the gearbox and clutch to be really compactly back against this thing. So it wasn't like the oyster shell assembly method that you'd see on a CB750. You open it up and there's a kickstart, output shaft, input shaft, and crankshaft. The thing is long. So this looked like a really good engine for his project. Unfortunately, we get old and die, and that's what Dan did. And all these plans were made, all this testing and so forth. They did a lot of computer simulation work. Ducati began to adopt computer simulations for the intake process and combustion around the year 2000. This kind of thing can be highly effective. And of course, at the time, we were eager to see this thing run. Now, to my knowledge, it has not done so, and there are no plans that it should.
I think it did. We weren't there. Yeah, we weren't there for it. Chuck showed me the cylinder heads. So Chuck Palmgren was, the main guy working on it. What I loved about our visit is I said, the claimed horsepower was like 200 and do you remember what it was? Very high.
Like 270, something like that.
Yeah, I mean, just remarkable power for displacement. And what was cool about that, I was like, well, Dan, what's driving this? He's like, well, it's one more chance to make an impression. I'm like, as if you need to make an impression, Dan Gurney. But that's the racer, right? Like he just wants to keep going. So they did it. Yeah. Chuck showed me the cylinder heads on the flow bench, right? We went in and it wasn't just any flow bench. This was All American Racers flow bench. So it was made and it's on the wall and it's got the tubes. And then showing off as only a cylinder head guy could, he just stood back and he turned the vacuum on and it was loud as hell. And then he showed half-inch lift and the cubic feet per minute was like off the charts. It was beautiful, like how much that thing would flow. Mm-hmm. He just smiled satisfactorily and pretty amazing.
Yes. Well, at the same time, I mean, Mark and I have visited there and been welcomed and entertained. So Dan was approachable. One day, Steve Whitelock, who at the time was mechanic for Yvonne de Hamel's H2R 750 Kawasaki air-cooled triple two-stroke, and Kawasaki had the stock brake discs were stainless steel, 7 millimeters thick, 7 pounds a piece. And he was sort of bothered with this, and he'd seen some Indy cars that had holes drilled in the disc. So he hies it over to All American Racers and says to the guys, look, here's a problem. These discs are so heavy. Oh, give me that. The fellows go in the shop. They work out a hole pattern. They're drilling holes in this 7 millimeters thick stainless, which is horrible squeaky stuff that if you let the tool get dull, the drill, you're not going anywhere. All the effort from the drill motor is making smoke. So you have to keep a sharp tool if you're working stainless. And people saw those holy discs on Yvonne's bike, and they had to have them. It was, for a period, a national craze for people riding sporty motorbikes in the early 70s. And that was just a casual spark that flew off of All American Racers because somebody presented an interesting problem. It wasn't, get lost, kid. We're doing work here. This is a business. We have races to win. No, come on in. Let's look at it. So this to me is all American because informality has been the American way. And when I think of all American, also I think of Dan Gurney and partner winning the 24 hours du Mans on the GT40 Mark IV, which is the 427 powered Ford GT40 racing sports car. And I remember reading that it was hot in the prototype. So they said, just there's air conditioning kits over there. Put one on. Now, people drove there was a Maserati that had a big inch engine, sports racing Maserati. And it just cooked drivers right and left. The American way. Put air conditioning in that race car. And why not? With a 7-liter engine, you ought to be able to afford a few horsepower to keep the driver alert and not pulling into the paddock, into the pits every other lap to be basted so that he would cook to a nice brown. So that is the kind of solution that I think of as classically American. Of course, the car was built by Ford Special Vehicles in England, and the 427 was a truck motor that had been converted for American drag racing. But wonderful stuff. You put the big old iron motor in this racy sports car and win the 24 hours of Le Mans. And Dan had accomplishments like that, one after another. But he retained this interest in motorcycles, and the Alligator program went forward steadily because he never abandoned it. So that's okay with me. He also rode fair distances on Alligators. I went to the Yamaha party that they used to hold at Laguna in the aquarium. And here comes a whole bunch of alligators with Dan at the head. And they get off and come in. And they'd just blown in from Costa Mesa, is it?
Yeah. Well, that's Santa Ana.
Yeah. Santa Ana, yeah. And they were riding alligators as a way to get somewhere. I realized something though when I looked at the model of Alligator that he called the Instigator, which was the S&S big inch V twin. The chassis on that thing was made out of small diameter tubing, welded together in triangulated form that makes any person of my age think of Maserati's Type 61 birdcage Maserati. The word birdcage describing the complicated structure of little structural members, little tubes. And I think the engine came out through the bottom on that. But it was all very carefully thought out. So this is being able to turn his enthusiasm like a headlight on whatever project he wanted to go forward at the time.
Yeah, and we know, there was never intent to race this. Dan Gurney wanted something that at his height he could feel comfortable in and ride with a lot of confidence. And that was where a lot of their development on the Alligator chassis was focused. Was you were feet forward, the engine's in front of you, you have a backrest behind you, it was relatively long. The one that we tested was 60-inch wheelbase as we measured. The interesting thing about the way that it handled was that it had a very fast roll rate because it was squat, and I don't think the center of gravity was particularly different without a rider than a regular motorcycle. They did move the fuel down, and certainly the battery would be moved down. But once you put the rider on, who's sort of I think the Gator we weighed was 340 pounds. So, you have a significant influence on how the chassis operates. So putting the body on it is going to change that center of gravity.
For years, the British, maybe it was the journalists, pushed the idea that a low center of gravity was the deciding factor in whether or not a motorcycle handled well. And that has been shown to be false over and over again. People imagined that a motorcycle, here's a wheel, they imagined that a motorcycle on pavement pivoted around its tire contacts. And if that were true, then a low center of gravity would produce a rapid roll rate. Because what you want is to move all the mass as close to the roll axis as you can. And this is why a twin engine fighter with an engine on either wing in roll is kind of, did you want something? Where a single just goes twink. But in fact, in order to steer a motorcycle, you first have to lean it over. And you do that by steering opposite to the corner. So you're steering the wheels out from under the vehicle so that the vehicle is doing this. It's not pivoting around the tire contact. It's pivoting around the roll axis, which is in a conventional motorcycle, something like 21, 22 inches above the pavement. And so Dan's creation has everything as low as it can be and as close as possible to a roll center. So, and these are automobile racers, so they know about locating mass in space. So what you're trying to do is put everything as close to that line as possible. You don't have things sticking out, sticking up away from the roll axis. You have them crunched in tight to the roll axis as best you can. And
it was very quick. It was very quick to get to lean.
Quick to flick.
And then you had that 60-inch wheelbase. So it wasn't carving, you weren't like in any danger of sort of turning off the inside of the track like you might have been when you first tried a Yamaha R6 with the very steep rake and the short trail and the very lightweight and high revving 600. It wasn't like that. But it handled really well, and it was a pleasure to ride in that sense. You could sort of hang off. To really go. There's like famous pictures of Eddie Lawson. Lawson was part of the sphere. I think he went on a lot of those legendary Sunday rides where everybody was ripping alligators and speeding past the cops and all that on Ortega Highway. They were just weekly rides. Dan loved it, man. Eddie Lawson's at Willow Springs riding that bike, and he's I think dragging a butt cheek. He's just right about there because if you slid your butt off the seat, it did make, as you would with any motorcycle, it made it handle. It just shifted, helped you roll in and use less lean angle per mile per hour of corner speed.
Yep.
But it worked very well. It was for what it was. It's not MotoGP, right? It's not. We're never going to see that work in MotoGP because it doesn't have the weight transfer necessarily that we need to make all the things that need to happen and trail braking and hard braking and all of that. But man, it was quick, 0 to 60. The 700 cc version, 0 to 60 was incredibly quick, and it was still exceptionally quick in the quarter mile. And the other thing that you got was reduced frontal area. Mm-hmm. And so that motorcycle top speed testing was either 133 or 135 miles per hour. So
on that little motor.
Very, a really,
Impressive.
impressive and a fun bunch of qualities. And of course, the chassis is made out of little tiny tubes, space framed together, because they weren't going to. They had a whole composites division. They were making giant wings for droney type stuff. They did all kinds of very interesting projects.
That was Apex Space and Defense, and they did have
Yeah.
an autoclave, which is a huge oven in which you bake the bagged parts and at a particular temperature to cure the binder, the plastic binder.
What Kevin means by bagged parts is that you put the fabric, your carbon fiber fabric, and then you put the resin in that is the glue that holds all that together, and then it's suctioned by this bag that squeezes it to its beautiful end shape.
Because what you don't want is empty places in the thing, in the material, and you don't want carbon fibers are very stiff. They don't drape well. They don't want to lie down in the mold. Oh, this is so comfortable. Like a cat can get into a box that's smaller than it is. I don't know how they do it. But if carbon fiber would do that, you wouldn't need to bag it. But the bag is there to force it against the mold so that you get the shape that's desired. And they were deep into this aerospace business with this type of autoclave cured,
right? And they had ovens
CFRP parts
that were 100 feet. I mean, they had a lot of. They were really, really doing it. They were doing very exotic, very interesting stuff. There was a engine development program that Drino Miller was working on. They were trying to get very high specific horsepower with an efficiency target, and that was. It was a fun lunch with him, Dan, and Drino, because this is where you saw Dan's highly competitive nature and drive come out. We're at lunch, and I'm talking to Drino Miller about cylinder heads on two strokes, because they were using two strokes potentially to run these engines because of the specific horsepower, but they were trying to squeeze the most out of it per pound, and then how do you get efficiency? And I had been with Jim Fueling, and he was showing me his two-stroke cylinder heads that he was trying to put on a CR 500. And he had the cylinder head, and it had basically like a teardrop combustion chamber. The whole thing was squish. The whole cylinder head, this area of the piston was squish, except for the very center. And then it had like grape-shaped little hole, but pointy, almondish. Mm-hmm. And then there was a spark plug in this tiny little thing, and it was shaped like a rocket nozzle. So they were compressing everything into a tiny kernel right around the spark plug. And I don't know what they were using to fire something like that, but it's harder to make a spark under extremely high pressure. So who knows what was going on there. But, Drino Miller had tried, similar things on that. And we were just talking about it, and it was a really engaging conversation. And I said, man, this must be a lot of fun to Drino. And Dan had been sitting there kind of listening, and he turns over and he looks at Drino. He said, well, it would be a lot more fun if we were hitting our targets. And I was like, that right there is a champion. That is a good example of a champion with a lot of drive, right?
Yep. Well, the idea of a pre-chamber, of course, the orbital two-stroke had a pre-chamber. Ricardo describes pre-chamber on his E65 test engine. So the concept has been around for some time. Diesels, that's a particular type of pre-chamber that was used at one time. But you have to, in order to try these things, you either have to have the idea originally or know about it or have it somewhere around there so that you can, let's try this. And these things show that these guys were, they read the literature, they had a lot of experience, and they would try things that looked like they could solve the next problem that was holding them back. And of course, that's the nature of engineering. The way they talk about the development of a motorcycle is as though, well, the engineers are about to do this beautiful work, and they're going to forecast everything mathematically, and it will all come out perfectly. Well, they've got a shipment date for this product. The financial analysts, aka bean counters, want to hit this date because all the money that's borrowed to tool for a new product has to be paid for in a timely fashion. So we can't scorn bean counting because it's necessary for these operations to succeed. But what do you do when the problem won't get out of your way, even if you ask nicely? So the general nature of engineering is a crisis. And you're trying A, trying B, right through to the end of the alphabet sometimes. And it's not always possible to solve the things in the time you have, so you have to take another route to get the result you want. And there are some fascinating development stories of all kinds of equipment, aerospace stuff, internal combustion engines. The latest one to come to my attention is what I'm thinking of as the Ducati novel. The big superbike twin started at 115 horsepower and in still as under 1,000 cc's, it signed off at essentially 200 horsepower over a period from 1988 to 2000. And one after another crippling problem. We're breaking valves, we're breaking closing levers, we're breaking cylinder liners because they kept boring the thing out bigger, bigger, bigger. And well, if it won't, we can't solve that problem that way. We're going to lengthen the stroke so we can leave the bore small for now, because later they're going to make a 112 millimeter bore. So this business of pushing forward through a minefield of problems is the business of engineering.
Yeah, and the business of business is you do the best you can in the time you have allowed, and then you ship it.
Yep.
And you go, okay, that's going to pay for itself. It's going to do its, you hope, it's going to do its thing, and we get to begin somewhat anew, like depending on, is it version 1.2 or is it version 2.0? Are we redesigning the cases to accommodate a bore that's fantastically larger than ever conceived?
Well, I would love to know where they came up with. Why was it Alcan 143 alloy? Why wasn't it a European alloy? What was special about that Canadian aluminum? Maybe it's just that it was available. The big data centers that are going up in the U.S. now that need lots of electric power, they've got all the gas turbine capacity in the U.S. maxed out, so they're now looking overseas for gas turbines to drive generators to make power for these data centers. You go where the problem leads you. And one of the things that I saw in Dan's office, just sitting on the carpet, was a cylinder off of a Bristol Centaurus. He had a friend who raced Sea Furies in air racing and said it made a nice little sport plane too. Thousands of horsepower.
Oh gosh, yes.
And there was sitting on the carpet. I doubt too many people who visited there could identify it, but I knew the relationship ahead of time. So there it was.
That's weird.
Lovely stuff. Because, of course, Dan had friends in all kinds of racing.
Yeah.
Land, air, and sea. I think the Apex Space and Defense Division has been sold since 2021. But, of course, you had to expect that there would be changes after Dan was gone because under new management.
Well, you have to. That would be a good question. We don't know that or what the specific business is. I know they do stuff for SpaceX. I will say that in many of my conversations with Dan, he credited Justin with saving the company. It's his son, who I mentioned earlier.
Yeah.
He said he got him. He got basically. He said, he did the aerospace stuff, and he got the government as a customer. And he said, turns out the government's a very good customer. Because once you crack the nut, once you're a supplier and you've been vetted and you're producing things that they find useful, that you have a relationship that carries on. It seems so. What was nice with Dan was that even in his 80s, he was still doing this. He, as any of us can hope, to be interested, also interesting, and that we're off continuing to think about it and try to understand more and solve the problems. There he was. And we went to AAR and we saw drawings, and they were asking us our opinion, which was, I thought it was incredibly courteous of them. Don't you think? I mean, I feel like we do have combined between you and I, I have ridden everything. I've raced. I have an interest in engineering. I am not an engineer, but I'm an engine builder, and I've rebuilt transmissions, and I got feeler gauges and a TIG torch and a mill, and I do my best. I always ask myself, who am I if I don't use this? So if it's time to build the exhaust system for the car or the truck, or to mill a tool so that I can fix my hydraulic jack, like, I cannot outsource this. I have the production. If I own it and I don't use it, what does it mean? So I think I'm vested in all of this, but the fact that Chuck and Dan and other engineers who were involved in this project would invite us there and sit us at the table, tell us about it, and say, what do you think? And that they would listen with such respect to people of our background. It was a really wonderful moment. It was always great to visit that shop because of everything that happened there. And at the time that I was there, that Remington, the fabricator who had done all that stuff, Phil Remington, or Rem as they call him, like, he still had his workstation existed there. Mm-hmm. His stuff was still there, his tools, and there was a lot that was in place way back when I was there. He was still alive, in fact. Just wonderful. Or seeing the photographs of the headers on, I believe it was the Formula One car, but they were all, the exhaust primaries were all hand formed without seams. They were not welded up.
Yeah.
They were heated and bent, packed with sand. And they were single piece, and they were amazing. And they were, when you have a V8 of certain timing, if you have a conventional V8, like in an American style car, the way the timings go, you actually want one of the cylinders in one bank to talk to the other cylinder in the other bank. Otherwise the timings overlap, and you get pressure, and then you go kick up and up again. And so
then a pause.
All of that stuff. That's where that great American V8 sound comes from. And then you have the flat crank guys, like Ferrari and stuff, that makes the kind of that ripping sound. In any case, those exhaust pipes were like that. And then you had the crossover between the banks, and then it was this fabled hot V. So the stuff was coming up in between the V. The exhausts were coming out the top because it's Formula One car, and we're going to let it fly. It's like we don't need no hoods.
Yeah.
It was gorgeous. So all of that happening. Anyway, it was to sit with Dan and Chuck and to go through that and to see this thing. And, it's a twin. It was a 5-inch bore, 127 millimeters, and a stroke of 2.8 inches, which was like 70. What did I wrote it down here? 71.1.
Yeah.
And, it didn't spin at an astronomically high RPM.
9,000.
Yeah, but it filled the cylinder, and that's where the power that they were looking at was about 280 horsepower. And I just try to envision what that would have been like in an Alligator that weighed, because it wouldn't have weighed much more than the single cylinder one would have. It would have weighed probably 25 or 30 pounds more at the most.
And you have to bear in mind that anytime you do power gearing, there's a possibility that there could be problems. You might have to do it over again several times until it told you what it wanted.
Yeah.
Um, for example, the original external flywheel for the FTR 750 was splined, and it wasn't a press fit, so that the rattling caused by the cylinders firing um, tended to pound the thing loose so that it rattled on the crankshaft. So how are you going to fasten those gears on there? Well, in the case of the Kawasaki KR250 tandem twin, the two cylinders were one ahead of the other, they were pressed on. And I don't think those pressed on gears came off too easily. But at the design speed of 12,000 RPM, it was roughly a 1 foot diameter on those 100 millimeter gears. And so the mesh engaging speed was 12,000 feet per minute, which is right up there. And there would have had to be those phasing gears would have had to be lubricated by oil jet and not by dipping into an oil level, because there lies heavy loss from oilage.
Yeah. Yeah. We talked about that in another program, but through my deep research into the XS 650 as a owner of the 72 that I had recently revived on Ranman Parked, a motorcyclist program. I raced Arma last year, and I was like, man, I got to build a race bike. And I looked at the XS because it's got a pretty good aftermarket. There's many things you can do, but one of the things they do is deep sump. You put a sump on where the screen is. There's a sump plate, and it's a deep sump. And horsepower goes up, heat goes down, because those flywheels are turning in oil in an XS 650 engine, which is fine if you're rattling around back roads and you're kickstarting and riding to the coffee shop, but keeping it ripping, the whole idea of sumps and keep, dry sumps or semi-dry sumps, anything that puts that oil away from the crank.
Keep the oil away, yes, because Ducati found that if their riders did a victory wheelie for some distance, the oil system would run dry. So they had to have a sump that was deep enough and shaped in such a way that any likely stable wheelie position would remain oiled up for X minutes.
Yeah, so the lore is that when Harley was replacing the Dyna with the single line, the soft tails, so they were basically bringing the two big twins together, and they settled on a soft tail type design, and they had done, a huge rework of their big cruiser. Is that they got the Dyna bros to come in, the Dyna guys who were like sport, stunt, wheelie burnouts, and they just put them on the test track and said, hey, have at it, just to make sure that everything would function in this extreme use case.
Yeah.
And it did. So it's pretty good.
Yeah,
I had a person working at Triumph back in the day when Triumph was coming back in to manufacturing motorcycles and coming into the American market again with under John Bloor. And he said, you just can't believe what the end user can break.
Yes. Yes. So true. Well, one of the things that struck me, I'm looking at the motorcycle, the Alligator version that Dan called Instigator, which was the S&S twin-powered model. And there's a side view of himself on this motorcycle. And he's got a low seat position of 20 inches. And his feet are forward. And I thought, it's a cruiser. There's the V-twin in betwixt his knees. And And it's a classic cruiser, except taken to an extreme. Extremely low seating position, nothing to do with sitting on a seat that's above the rear tire. Forget that completely. You're ahead of the rear tire so that your bum can be lower down.
That was one of Steve Anderson wrote the road test on that Alligator that we had tested, and Steve was editor of Cycle and engineer. He's worked at different manufacturers. Interesting, curious person, and he said he was always adamant that there's no such thing as a performance cruiser. And then he tested the Alligator, and he said, "You know what? This is a performance cruiser."
Yeah.
So we have a concurrence of thought.
Yes. But it was a moment of recognition when I thought, this is a cruiser. But that's Dan Gurney there.
Yep.
Does that work? The moment canceling engine, the name means that when you want to roll, when you want to change direction, that the resistance to roll, the gyro resistance of the two cranks opposite in sign. So that moment, that resistance torque to changing direction is self-canceling. So very quick to change direction, even with this more powerful engine.
I wish we could have seen it.
Yes, we do wish that.
Yeah, I had a conversation with Justin about it a number of years ago, Justin Gurney, and he said he was sort of like, he totally understood why his dad was doing it, but he's like, come on, Dad, like, who needs a 300 horsepower motorcycle? And it's like Dan Gurney needs a 300 horsepower motorcycle. That's who.
Yeah, because you're always seeking more. Because who's going to get to a point and say, there, that's it, perfect, needs nothing? No, the thing that happens every year, people and organizations build a race bike for a particular competition, and by the time they get it to the first race, they realize their mistakes. And they realize more during the year. Who designed this thing? It takes so long to take apart. And this was one of the things that during the time that Ducati were having to bring so many engines to the races because they were breaking all the time. They got the engine changed down to 20 minutes. That's one way. Just put in a fresh one. You can't do that forever, but might get you through a bad place.
Well, it's one of my favorite expressions of yours, Kevin, is 100% doesn't make the grid. Right? You got to show up. It's just when the race starts. That's it.
Yes.
You could be tired. I was in Barber last year racing Arma, and I'm staying in a hotel, and I'm trying to get to bed. I'm trying to do my job, so I'm looking at a computer after being at the track all day, and I'm in the hotel, and we have a dinner and whatever, and do a little bit of work, and it's finally, man, I got to get up and race in the morning. I better get to bed. And you go to bed, and the fire alarm goes off, and it's 1 o'clock in the morning, and you're like, oh, and the strobe light is flashing because that's what they do for. If you can't hear the alarm, there has to be something that's incredibly attention grabbing.
Yes.
And there I was, like, I mean, you can't be serious. And then they came on the speaker and said, "Oh, it's a false alarm. We don't need to evacuate, and we're really sorry." But there I was at 1-something in the morning, bright-eyed. You just got to show up, man. Everybody's got to be there. That's it. Bike's got to be as good as it is, and as do you.
Yeah. Well, those things are, that's the way it is with us humans. We can think a lot bigger than we can make, always. And so you have to do triage on your ideas. Well, these two ideas are fascinating, but they're too expensive for our organization. That's what Alfred Neubauer, long racing director at Mercedes-Benz, said when he went to BRM and saw the supercharged V16. Very nice design. Too bad you don't have the resources to make it win races. And it never did.
Yeah, we
So,
had a years ago, 2 owners ago, the magazine was owned by a company that was being run by a guy who had a personal life coach, and I can't even imagine what a personal life coach does or how your mindset gets into that position. But he had one, and he's a motivational guy and obviously a good salesperson. And I called it the Learning to Levitate training because they were going to convince us that we were going to read minds and innovate, think big, bigger than Apple, etc. And we were, challenged to think of ways that, the internet could be used and we could do virtual reality and all these. They were lauding all of these incredible concepts that we were presenting. And I was thinking to myself, I'm down here shoveling coal, and what they want to hear about is solving energy problems. And I was like, well, let's put solar panels on Mercury. That'll make some power.
yes.
Never mind, all the, you have those ideas. You have the solar panels on Mercury, but you also got to shovel coal. You need the power right now.
Right now.
So let's anyways, it reminded me of that, the BRM.
Yeah.
That's such a beautiful era. If you have never read about Raymond Mays,
And Peter Burton.
yep, yep,
There's a wonderful book called Split Seconds, which is about the early career of those people leading up to the BRM project. And there's also a book by Tony Rudd. I think it's published by the SAE. And Tony Rudd was transferred to BRM, and it was one of those very British situations where, well, what am I supposed to do here? Well, you'll find a way to fit in. And so he went out and watched the prototype going around corners, and the axles are just the wheels are bouncing, the thing is sliding sideways, and the driver has a job. He's not going to say it's junk. Start over. But that's what they needed to do. They didn't have the time. They didn't have the money. It was a primitive ladder frame, twisty as can be, with this, depending on which version you're thinking of, 500 horsepower, 1.5 liter V16 with little pistons. And never won anything because they, like Mr. Neubauer, Herr Neubauer said, they lacked the money ever to make it win races. So a measure of realism. This is why race teams have people like Jerry Burgess and Kel Carruthers and Irv Kanemoto and Araldo Faraci, because they know what's practical. They have the experience to be able to say, that is a money trap and that is a life trap. You'll spend your life and you won't be able to solve that one.
Who was it at Honda? Was it Martin Adams? The engineers handed over the engineers handed over, and we're the farmers. We got to get it done. There's nothing you can do. The weather's coming, and we got to get that hay. That's it. That's showing up to the grid and making it work. And that's what he said. Is that we just we pick up what they give us, and some of it's good, some of it's challenging, and we just get to harvest.
Yep. Well, it was Mathers. It was Mathers who was in charge of racing at American Honda for a long time, who made the analogy with the farmer.
Yeah, Gary Mathers.
Yeah. Do we get an engineer? No, because he'll take 6 months to study the problem and then file a report. How come I didn't get one? You weren't on the list. but it's my problem.
Yeah.
No, you get a farmer because a farmer is used to dealing with problems like the aforesaid. Sky is darkening. The hay has been cut and is lying on the ground. It needs to be baled and put under cover. Get that baler working.
And no offense to the engineers, because
No,
they,
they
they,
definitely have their place. You don't
yeah,
send a farmer to calculate torsional stability of crankshafts.
no, because that's how you end up with farm equipment that weighs tons.
Yeah.
So, or Ford 460s.
Yes.
Well, that's it for Dan Gurney's moment canceling twin and the Gurney Alligator and all the other things about. I wish we could talk about that great guy's whole life, but we're here for the two-wheel part of it, so that's what we mostly enjoyed. I hope to honor his legacy by keeping his XR 1200X in good condition and riding it nearly as fast as he did. Apparently, what did Justin say? I can tell you that motorcycle goes precisely 128 miles per hour. So Dan's was black and Justin's was white, and they used to ride them together. He said he loved it. So it's cool to have a piece of that in some weird way. I also have Dan Gurney's Hog card, his Harley owners group, because anytime you bought a Harley, you were automatically enrolled and they gave you a card, and it says Dan Gurney Hog. Phenomenal. Anyway, thanks for listening, folks. Get down in the comments. Tell us what you like. Share some topics. We got topics. We'd love to hear what you.
Guidance required.
Yeah, absolutely. And we will catch you next time. Thank you.